All right. So today's presentation is Are You Prepared and How the CMS Disaster Rule Affects Food and Nutrition Services by Jo Miller, RDN and PH. She received her BS in Nutrition Science and a minor in Food Service Management from UC Davis, and then went on to complete her dietetic internship at Napa State Hospital. She then completed a master's in Public Health from UC Davis with an emphasis on nutrition, informatics, and journalism. Jo is currently the Vice President at Meals for All with a focus on volume emergency nutrition, preparedness, and education. So as you can hear, Jo has much expertise in her field within food and dietetics. And this doesn't seem to always be a topic that we're constantly thinking about in preparedness, but after you hear this presentation, I think that we'll soon realize that it is something we should be thinking about and preparing for. So Jo, I'm going to turn this over to you, and thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and the opportunity. And as she said, today we're going to talk about a little bit of a different topic for many of you as it relates to disaster planning, but we're going to look at the CMS disaster rule and an all-hazard vulnerability assessment from the angle of food and nutrition's perspective. And one of the challenges is everybody has to eat. And as a registered dietitian and someone who has run skilled nursing kitchens and hospitals, we know that it's a huge challenge for emergency preparedness, for facilities management, and for the food and nutrition side. And this is a great conversation to bring all of those disciplines together and realize that none of us are alone and we can support each other and come up with a great plan and be regulatory compliant. So as you can see with the objectives, we've got a pretty full plan today. And again, we're going to look at everything from a food and nutrition perspective. The one thing I do want to highlight during today's conversation is as we're talking about disaster meal planning for your healthcare facility, also start thinking about disaster meal planning for your home and what you're having at home. Some of the items that we're going to talk about really work well for our business, our work, but also our home. And after all, we want to create a culture of preparedness within our environment. So the all-hazard vulnerability assessment from a nutrition perspective, trends and best practices on disaster nutrition planning, of course, the CMS rule. There are a ton of resources available for food and nutrition services, meal and water options. First, we're kind of looking at what's going on throughout the United States. And in the last handful of years, it seems like every time we turn around, there's something happening. As you look at this slide, you can see that almost every part of the United States is vulnerable to disasters. And this slide, you may think, oh, if I'm in Arizona, Wyoming, I'm fine. This is only looking at billion-dollar in weather and climate-related disasters that have happened in the United States. To look at a more manageable perspective, 2018 alone, we had a number of billion-dollar disasters, from the fires that hit us in Paradise, California, to the hurricanes throughout the Gulf. But as we look through the Midwest, we see a number of hailstorms that created a lot of damage, not only to healthcare facilities, but personal property. But when we're looking at hailstorms and freezes, this also significantly affects our food supply and how we're going to be able to provide food for our population when needed. So there is a ton of resources available from FEMA, and I know many of us as emergency preparedness professionals spend a fair amount of time on a FEMA site. Of course, they want us to plan, prepare, mitigate, and we want to do this before, during, and after. And that's something that as emergency planning professionals, we're always looking to do. There's some amazing information at FEMA, and we're always encouraging our food and nutrition professionals to check out the site and look at what's going on by year for your region. And so this slide, we're just looking at major disaster declarations. This isn't every disaster that happened in the United States, but the major disasters that were declared for the United States as whole. This also includes territories as well as reservations. In 2019, as of last week, we had 79 major disasters declared. But on that FEMA side, you can actually take that a step further and look by state. And if you're new to your region, new to your territory, or you're working with food and nutrition services, and you really want to help them understand more the challenges in your region, this is a great way to look at your state, identify the major disasters declared. So right now we're looking at the state of Mississippi and every disaster that's been declared in the last few years. So we can see a lot of storms, straight line winds, tornadoes, and flooding over and over. So we know that if we're in Mississippi, the bulk of the disasters are related to this. It doesn't mean those are our only disasters we're planning for, but it really helps you get a base for your most likely hazards. What's nice is you can also click on the incident, identify the counties affected, and the resources provided to support those counties. Now, as we're building our all-hazard vulnerability assessment, and again, I know some of this is review, but we're really thinking of food and nutrition services. It's a little different of a conversation. So loss of normal water supply is a huge one for your kitchen. How are you going to prepare food? How are you going to provide fluids for your healthcare facility if you have a Flint, Michigan style disaster where the water isn't accessible? And the last handful of years, we've also seen a number of outbreaks related to Legionnaire's disease, which is an airborne bacteria that loves water and can render your healthcare facility to have no water access for food prep drinking. But that also goes towards hygiene, flushing, also, different procedures that may need to happen. Other things that'll affect specifically food and nutrition is an issue with gas lines. Many of us live and work in areas of aging infrastructure, and we're always trying to stay on top of it, but time and time again, we hear of issues with gas lines and leaks, as well as loss of power. These are all things that will affect food and nutrition services a little different than everything else. But we also, of course, need to plan for armed individuals and how are you going to provide meal service during that time. Loss of heat, this could be huge. If it's winter, now we may be in an evacuation situation, and how are we going to provide meals as we're evacuating? So different things to think about as you're building those plans. So we want to plan, prepare, educate, and practice. And again, just like FEMA said, before, during, and after. So let's look at the best practices for the United States on disaster meal planning. And again, as we have this conversation, really start reflecting on what are you doing for food and nutrition at your home? Do you have enough food for your family? Do you have enough water for your family? So the best practice is that you have supplies on site. And what we see in many facilities is they're rotating those items every 6 months to a year. This is because on cans, if you've never worked in a kitchen, we get Julian dates from our prime vendors. And these dates are use by dates, suggested use by. We're in the US and we need to follow those. And so if we're in food and nutrition services and we're doing a canned supply, we really got to keep up on those dates. And it means there's a lot of hands and constant rotation. If you have a shelf-stable supply of disaster food already, you just need to update your policy and procedures and state, we rotate supplies per manufacturer's recommended guidelines. And this also applies to water. Some of you may have an MOU on water, or some of you may have a water agreement that you could keep water beyond its expiration date, some sort of a policy from the manufacturer, and you just want to make sure that's very clear in your policies and procedures manual that you're following your manufacturer's recommended guidelines. Secondly, we want to have a nutrient analysis on our policy and procedures manual. This was an interesting one, and this came to light actually in 2013 in California, of all places, when it became regulation. And part of why that became regulation in California is many healthcare facilities were really struggling to meet the specific needs of their patient population. And California really wanted to see healthcare mirroring their disaster plan with the regular menu, because in healthcare, we're working with a highly sensitive population, and we started to see more and more studies and research coming out related to post-disaster effects and negative outcomes related to morbidity and mortality from not managing chronic diseases. And managing chronic diseases is critical. If you wanted to get more research on that, I'm happy to send it out. There's also some great papers related to the Fukushima earthquake and managing chronic diseases in the elderly post-disaster. So that became regulation, and it's highly recommended. One of the things that we found is we started going back and looking at the nutrient analysis for disaster menus, whether they're for healthcare or Gen Pop, they're very low in calories. A lot of the products you may even have from your home tend to be between 800 and 1,200 calories a day. So it's always a good plan to go back, revisit your nutrient analysis, and make sure you're meeting the patient needs as well as the high caloric needs that your staff's going to have, because they're going to be working incredibly long hours. Of course, post your policy and procedures manual. We know in a disaster you may or may not have electricity. Having everything stored on the internet can be costly as it comes to implementing your plan in a timely manner. Yearly, all staff in services, and we just talked about that vulnerability assessment. There's a lot of things you're going to want to address, so you may want to do quarterly or even a more casual in-service as you do your stand-ups and meetings with your team, but at least a yearly documented in-service. And if your emergency department, your emergency planning department hasn't already brought food and nutrition services into your full-scale disaster drills, we highly recommend it. So we've performed a number of full-scale disaster drills in the last couple of years with hospitals, and have found that a lot comes out of including food and nutrition services in that, and we're really able to highlight where some of the gaps are and things that we can make better implementing those programs. So if you're not already working with your food and nutrition services department, bring them on in for that next drill rather than just a tabletop. So we're going to talk about the regulations and how, of course, the new CMS regulations relate to food and nutrition services, but I do want to highlight that your city, county, and state may have more bolstered regulations than the federal regulations. California and Florida in particular do have more strict regulations than the federal regulations. So we're just going to focus on the feds, but if anyone has state-specific questions that I can address, you can go ahead and throw those in your chat box, and I'll address them in real time. My last statement related to city, county, and state. Many of the counties, especially rural counties, will recommend more than the minimum best practice 3 days of disaster planning or 4 days if you're a Joint Commission accredited facility. Oftentimes we see in our rural and mountainous areas, the counties would love to see healthcare do a 5 to 7 day plan. So if you're not currently working with the counties or have reached out to them, definitely recommend that. And if they are recommending a plan beyond our base, also see if the county has any funding available to help you bolster that to meet those enhanced expectations. So let's meet those new regulations. First, why did we get new regs? And it really came down to Hurricane Katrina. The Office of the Inspector General went back and looked at many of the skilled nursing facilities impacted throughout Louisiana and the Gulf after Hurricane Katrina. And they found that 94% of facilities met those federal standards. 80% of them were doing appropriate training. Everybody experienced issues. And these issues were everything from memorandums of understanding with prime vendors just not being honored. You think your prime vendor is going to be able to bring you food mid-disaster, but in a flood, such as the flood that we experienced during Hurricane Katrina, it just wasn't possible. And we see this time and time again when there's infrastructure damage in a region. The other reason why we have this new rule is because they wanted to enhance really relationships between provider types and consistencies. So many of our hospitals also have hospice or renal dialysis or maybe like a PACE community or skilled nursing facility that is associated with our healthcare group. And they wanted to bring in all provider types as they enhance these regulations. And so none of this is new to anybody on today's call, but again, we're thinking about this from a food and nutrition services perspective. So if you do have an organization that has many different provider types, you know, it may be time to ask those questions. Okay, my hospital has a great plan, but does our PACE community, our dialysis, our hospice, how are we planning on meeting the needs of those residents in a disaster? Okay. And then I have a great question. Have you included food services and the preparedness community? So food and nutrition, dietitian, nutritionist. If your registered dietitian or your director of food and nutrition, or at least somebody from your FAMS department is not part of your current safety team, they most certainly should be. Everybody has to eat, and they are professionals in volume nutrition feeding and how to scale a recipe. Oftentimes they're overwhelmed and don't have time for one more committee, but you can definitely reach out to the department. There's probably a shining star, an intern, somebody from there that can be represented. So I definitely recommend reach out to your food and nutrition services team, invite them to be a part of that safety team and safety committee, and you'll definitely come out better in the long run for that. Okay, so different types of facilities. Of course, your standard inpatient, your hospitals, critical access SNFs, and I already mentioned those outpatient providers that may be associated with your hospital are all affected by the rule in one way or another. Some aren't required to keep food on hand, some are, and we'll talk about the resources and how to identify what those expectations are. Okay, so are you prepared? The CMS preparedness rule has 4 conditions of participation, and there is actually a 5th related to generators, and that's not usually kitchen related. If you do have generators in your kitchen, if you've got the red plugs in there as well as backup generators on your refrigerators and freezers, that is amazing. Throughout the United States, that definitely is a rarity, and we don't see that often. So kudos if you work in a facility that has your kitchen on backup generators. That's definitely going to take you a long way when you need it. So we already looked at risk assessment, that all hazard vulnerability assessment, but we really want to look at that from a food and nutrition services perspective. And then, of course, build a policy and procedure for each one. So as we talked about loss of water, what is our policy if we have a loss of water? How are we going to address that? Loss of gas, loss of power, how are we going to provide food in those situations? So we want to build that policy and procedures specific to that department. Of course, communication. When you're running incident command, you're going to have your incident command set up, and you're going to have somebody running the food and nutrition services and really relaying information when and where you want to set up tray lines. But they also have to be able to communicate information like diet orders. How are they going to continue to meet those? Where you're going to triage the meals out at. And oftentimes you're going to probably set up multiple places of meal service. If your kitchen is not damaged, you know, if you're not in a hurricane situation or an earthquake, and you could continue to prepare meals from your kitchen without, with limited staff and utilities, that's great. But you may want to build a plan to set up a tray line on the patio, on the lawn, in an alternative site. And kind of get those identified in advance and ways that you'll communicate that information. And then, of course, train and test. And, you know, the other follow-up to the last question is, how do you exercise with food and nutrition? And can I share objectives offline? Most certainly. And what I've seen done in the past is oftentimes when you're doing your full wide-scale disaster drill, the way you would incorporate food and nutrition services in that is have food and nutrition services provide a disaster meal to your ops team during that wide-scale disaster drill. So you're kind of drilling both things. You're drilling your campus, but then food and nutrition is also in their own full-scale disaster drill. And then you could provide them a list of different types of scenarios. So, okay, you have no water today. We're going to set up a tray line in the ops room, go, and see how that goes, and then come up with your plan of correction from there. So I mentioned there's a ton of resources available for your campus, and many of you are probably very familiar with the emergency preparedness rule and the downloads. For food and nutrition services, we spend a lot of time evaluating the surveyor's tools. And from the surveyor's tools, that's where you'll be able to find out which provider type needs to provide what type of service. So for instance, a renal dialysis clinic is not required to provide meals, and you'll see that in the surveyor's tools. So when we look at the conditions of participation and kind of dig a little bit deeper into the interpretive guidelines, the only place that they're really talking about food and nutrition services is that sustenance requirement, and where it states that we have to have provision and needs for staff and patients, and here's the kicker, whether we evacuate or shelter in place. And that word evacuate is massive. How are we going to evacuate food, water, medical, and pharmaceutical supplies? Now, the interpretation that we've received a number of times on evacuation, that evacuation until your patients are admitted into another healthcare facility or are able to go home or getting care in some other manner. But if you are evacuating to, say, a mass care and shelter that maybe isn't a specific medical needs shelter that's managing all of your patients in one area, then you will need to manage, their food, water, pharmaceutical, and medical supplies. So different things to consider. Also, under the interpretive guidelines, though, CMS is really saying that you, the healthcare facility, have the flexibility to identify your needs. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is not telling you you need to have 3 days or you need to have 10 days. They're telling you you need to do a hazard vulnerability assessment, look at your capabilities and capacities, and from there, identify what you need. If you're in, I'm speaking to you today actually from Pasadena, California. I'm at the California Hospital Association Disaster Planning Conference, where we're evaluating disasters that have happened throughout the state in the last year. And in Pasadena, California, I'm incredibly high risk for earthquake. The infrastructure in this area is very poor. So while a 3-day disaster plan may be my minimum expectation, because of my hazard vulnerability assessment, I may likely have a 5, or even in downtown Los Angeles, a 7-day disaster meal plan, because I know that my prime vendor is not likely going to be able to support me during that disaster. The other thing under interpretive guidelines that I didn't put in the slide that they really did kind of hide in there is they also want you to be prepared to provide food and shelter to people from the community that may come and seek shelter. And this is a huge challenge for many healthcare facilities because this is a very interesting number. How do you know how many people from the community may come? And I'll show you some tools that can help support you to identify this very challenging question momentarily. So there are a number of EP tags. There are 44. Of the 44, the ones highlighted on this slide relate to food and nutrition services in one way or another, whether it's, a policy on the sustenance needs, or how are you going to evacuate your food and water, how are you going to shelter in place or communicate between incident command and the kitchen. For the sake of today's presentation, we're not going to go into the details of these, but if you go to cms.gov, download resources and look under surveyors tools, you'll get very specific information on each tool or each tag and how it relates to that department in particular. I also want to highlight one regulation out of California, and we all know, as goes California, often goes the nation. Back in 2013, and then an addendum was made in 2014, California Department of Public Health All Facilities Letter, that's CDPHAFL, 1432 came out, and it made it regulation that you have to meet the needs of therapeutic diets and modified textures for all age groups in a disaster. It was a challenge at the time, and again, the reason why they did this is just as I was saying earlier, more and more information was coming out on the need to manage chronic diseases and disasters and address the fact that many of us weren't doing that. And so this is regulation out here. It's been regulation now since 2013. And honestly, I can say that the state has met this very well. It's very impressive, and it's something that as a best practice could easily be done throughout the United States. So looking at resources available, we looked at the regulation, we looked at the best practices. You're definitely not alone. And again, bring your food and nutrition services team in. What we found in many healthcare facilities, food and nutrition is doing one thing, and emergency may be doing the same thing, and they don't really know that they're both focused on the same policies, or you know, maybe have it a little different. So you definitely want to be consistent. CMS wants us, and again, this tool is the recommended tool for effective healthcare facility planning. It's an awesome multidisciplinary tool that includes your whole campus, and this highlighted section that I have is where we see some of the verbiage from CMS, because they can be so vague, on the fact that we want to have a 3 to 10 day supply based on that hazard vulnerability assessment. But CMS did go on to state back in 2013, following the experience of Hurricane Katrina, it's felt that the previous 72-hour recommendation may no longer be sufficient. So that's where you have those MOUs come into place. So if you've done your hazard vulnerability assessment, you've worked with your kitchen, you've identified your capabilities and capacities, and maybe your most likely disaster is a flood. And we know that a flood could dramatically affect the infrastructure of your region and your city and the ability for a prime vendor to get in. So you may decide you need a 5-day disaster plan, and then on days 6 and 7, you want that prime vendor to have that memorandum of understanding in place. But again, it's going to be variable based on your capabilities and capacities, your region, and your most likely hazards. Here's another tool, and again, I keep waiting for CMS to update that 2013 tool, but Asper Tracy came up with a similar one just recently, which is really nice, that you could find on the Asper Tracy Information Exchange. And here they go through policies and procedures, training, exercise, communication. It's a really nice checklist to work through with your safety team, and it also goes on to sheltering arrangements and additional recommendations. It's interesting because here on the Information Exchange, they are actually recommending that you maintain a supply even beyond that for 7 to 14 days. And this could be done in a number of different ways. Most healthcare facilities are getting deliveries of dry goods 2 to 3 days a week, and maintaining 7 days of dry storage and 2 days of perishable storage at any given time. So between the stock that they have in place and then your dedicated disaster plan, it can be very simple to create a policy to span longer than 7 days if needed. And again, you're really going to want to evaluate your capabilities and capacities to see if this is possible or what your regional needs are. So there's a couple other resources that I want to bring to your attention. And these are out of California. One of the reasons why a lot of the resources that I'm presenting today are out of California is in 2013, when CMS wrote the proposed rule, California just decided they were going to write their own regulations kind of ahead of the curve. So they updated theirs in 2013 when the rest of the nation updated in 2019. The California Association of Healthcare Facilities has a wonderful disaster preparedness program. And this disaster preparedness program was funded through federal money, which means it's free for the nation to utilize as a resource. And if you're in the process of revamping anything for your skilled nursing facility or system, and you want to look at some great templates and look at just some resources that you could build upon, there's no need to reinvent the wheel when there are a lot of basic tools already started and available for you. So the CAF Disaster Preparedness Program is a great resource. I have highlighted here the disaster response checklist. While this was created for Los Angeles County, everything on this list other than earthquake applies to anyone in the United States. So again, if you're bolstering your disaster response checklist for your campus, you can utilize this as a great template and build from there. Other things that you're going to find within that template are, just basic things for communication. Communication is oftentimes a bottleneck. When I was listening to the lectures just yesterday on the fires that have happened throughout California, communication came up again and again because it's become a major bottleneck and a huge challenge. So if we get ahead of these challenges in advance, we can have a more seamless evacuation and recovery if needed. Another tool that I want to highlight is from the California Hospital Association, and this tool is a phenomenal tool to help you answer the very difficult question of who am I feeding in a disaster? So with this tool, they do recommend licensed beds because the assumption is in a disaster, you are going to be full. So they start with licensed beds and then help you add a essential staff to patient ratio. And I really want to highlight essential staff. In a major disaster, you're not going to have every single staff member that works at your healthcare facility there at once. And the way that people identify that is everything from looking at shift change on a Tuesday. I've even heard of some hospitals looking at how many meals they did on Christmas. But the California Hospital Association has actually created a tool that allows you to use a ratio. And we see that ratio go from everything from 1.3 to 3 for a teaching hospital, or even 5 for a teaching hospital or children's hospital, where you may have a much higher essential staff to patient ratio based on your patient population. For those of you that are skilled nursing facilities or have a skilled nursing facility associated, the ratio that we commonly see utilized for essential staff to patients is 0.5 to 1. So if you're a 99-bed facility, you're going to have anything from 50 to 90 essential staff. The other great thing about this tool is it helps you identify surge targets and family members. Again, under the interpretive guidelines in the CMS disaster rule, they threw in there that we need to evaluate the possibility that people from the community may arrive to seek shelter. And once they arrive to seek shelter, it is our job as professionals to provide for them. And so this tool can really help you, again, answer that very difficult question. How many staff, family members, visitors, volunteers, people from the community may come in a disaster? This tool also has multiple tabs. It goes into everything from caloric needs, phase discharge. So if you're going to have maybe 1,000 people on day 1, 2, and 3, and then try to get that phase discharge going, or phase out non-essential staff, you know, your numbers and ratios may change, and this tool really helps you to do that. This tool also helps you identify those therapeutic diets and modified textures. So you could ahead of time plan on, based on my average census, how many diabetic meals do I have to have on hand? How many pureed and mechanical stock meals am I going to have in advance? Because in a disaster, you may not have the Food and Nutrition Services staff to modify and prepare those meals accordingly. So this is really a wonderful tool that applies for the whole nation, and it is available for free. If you put in your Google toolbar, CHA Emergency Food Supply Planning, Guidance, and Toolkit. It is also a resource at the end of this presentation. So now we're really going into the kitchen. We've looked at the regulations. We've looked at a ton of resources that really relate to food and nutrition services specifically. But next, how are we going to prepare meals when our kitchen looks like this? What other things do we need to consider as we're building that full policy for food and nutrition services? Other things to consider that I think we've talked about pretty extensively is how are you going to meet the needs of those critically ill patients or patients with chronic diseases? Can you provide a low sodium diet? It can be a huge challenge because, as we all know, many shelf-stable foods are incredibly high in sodium. So you want to work with your food and nutrition services team and see if some of these questions have been addressed. Mechanically altered textures are also a big challenge. The United States, well, the California Academy and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics for the entire nation has adopted the International Dysphagia Standardization Initiative. And this is a new dysphagia initiative that actually has more strict expectations on texture-modified diets. And so, can you meet the needs of those more strict altered textures? Is this something you've been working with your team on? Food safety is also a huge challenge. Yesterday, again, we were at this conference working with the California Hospital Association, and we were hearing presentations from OES talking about the foodborne illness outbreak that happened during the campfire evacuations, and then how are they having to manage the fact that we had a massive evacuation from a town, but then on top of that, we had a food safety issue in some of those evacuated camps, norovirus outbroke, and then on top of that, we had to separate patients, well patients from people that had norovirus, and then continue to manage that highly susceptible foodborne illness outbreak. It was quite challenging. And so when you're planning your disaster meal plan, is food safety a consideration? Is time your public health control? Is temperature? But then also, how are you training your team on hygiene, hand washing? Do you have appropriate sanitization? So you could prevent the outbreak of these common diseases. And then, is it easy to implement and prepare? We all know in a true disaster, you may not have trained staff that can scale those recipes. So something to consider. And then who are you feeding? Your residents, your staff, your patients, visitors, search. So what's to eat? There are a lot of different meal options available for you out there. And as we're talking about the food and what you're going to provide during a disaster, this is where I really want everybody to start thinking about, what are we having at home? Also, what is my meal plan at home? Because not everything that we'll evaluate is necessarily suitable for healthcare, but it could be great for a go bag or great for your family. We really want to focus on comfort food. This is a recommendation from the American Red Cross, and the American Red Cross recommends comfort foods because it provides peace of mind. During a major disaster, there's a lot of chaos going on. Many of you on today's call have been first responders, or you may even be ready to respond down to the Bahamas as we're having this discussion today. There's a lot of stress associated, and by giving somebody something that is familiar really goes a long way. Coffee. Very familiar. Coffee in the morning is critical on keeping peace of mind. Have something suitable for evacuations. Remember, part of the new CMS disaster rule is you can evacuate your plan, whether you're sheltering in place or you need to go to a mass care and shelter or evacuate people to different healthcare facilities in your region. So lightweight cases can be very helpful and critical. Another thing that I've seen quite a bit is having that disaster meal plan put on a wheeled metro in advance so that it's easy to roll out for evacuation. Or even I've seen people have their disaster food in a temperature-controlled, OSHPOD-approved trailer, which is very easy to evacuate. So those are different considerations on how you'll manage some of those considerations. So what's to eat? This is a list of items that we're all pretty familiar with. Traditional canned supplies, that's what most healthcare facilities are currently utilizing throughout the United States. But there are meals ready to eat, food bars, liquid and powdered supplements, as well as freeze-dried and dehydrated meals that can meet the disaster meal needs, again, for home and for your healthcare facility. So as we evaluate traditional food, that's your, kind of like we have in the slide, Chef Boyardee. We all know it. It's very familiar. Items like soups, sandwiches, cereals. The big benefit to having a traditional canned supply is it's familiar. It mirrors your regular infrastructure that you have in place so you can prepare it. The biggest challenge that we hear from our partners on maintaining the canned supplies, and you may know if you have a close relationship with food and nutrition, is that constant rotation because the dates on these products expire every 6 months to a year. And in the disaster, you need to make sure that you have critical staff that knows how to scale and prepare a recipe. So that's definitely something to consider as you're looking at your canned supplies. Now I'm accidentally in the chat. Now I'm out of the chat. Perfect. So MREs, meals ready to eat. If you're ex-military or military family, these are very familiar to you. My brother-in-law was Army and Air Force. He loves the lasagna and the brownies. These items have a long shelf life, 3 to 7 years. They're very dependent on temperature. So if you're evaluating something to be in your go bag or something to go in your home, in your attic for a disaster plan, this would not be the ideal option because they are susceptible to high temperatures. But if you keep them in a cool, dry location, you could get a 7-year shelf life, high calories, easy to store. The biggest challenge with MREs, though, is with our patients. They're incredibly high in sodium and also meals. And they have a hot pack in there that can actually be a huge challenge to critically ill or aging population. So we see these oftentimes used for home use, for work, for office buildings, but not as much for healthcare facilities because of the challenges meeting those needs. In incident command, they can also be really nice. So the other product that is commonly used for disaster meal planning is emergency food bars. And emergency food bars have very similar pros and very similar cons to meals ready to eat. They have a long shelf life. These are not temperature dependent. So if you're thinking for your go bag for your home, these are great to have in your go bag in the trunk of your car. Biggest challenge with patients is that comfort in familiar foods and meeting some of those therapeutics and modifieds. It's not a very familiar item, so if you're kind of looking for peace of mind, it definitely has some challenges, but if you're looking for something shelf-stable, something to have in your go bag, easy to use, this is an option that is available. Supplements. Supplements are in every single healthcare facility. And there's probably some of you that are listening to today's call that have worked in food and nutrition at one point in time and know we're always trying to limit supplement use, but they're not going anywhere. We have them, and if we have them in a disaster, we could definitely use them. We want to use them best, though, to supplement our disaster plan. So the pro is they're easy to store, and we could add calories and bolster calories to our plan. Remember, many disaster meal programs can be incredibly low in calories, or some of our residents and patients, as they get stressed, they may have a lack of appetite, and same goes for your staffing as they're working these long hours. The downside is you do not want to have a disaster plan that is 6 and short a day. That could be a huge challenge, not only to palatability and peace of mind, as well as comfort and familiar, but if you have them, you can definitely utilize them to supplement that plan and add 200 to 500 calories additional per day to whatever you're doing in your healthcare facility. One of the interesting things about supplements, we never recommend storing them with your disaster meal plan. You want to keep them stored with your supplements, but work off a par stock. And that's just because supplements have variable expiration dates. And time again, if you start storing those with your emergency stock, you're just going to have a lot of expired products. But if you keep, say, a 7-day par with your nursing supplies, that ensures that you always have what you need for daily use, but then you also have an additional par stock that can be utilized to supplement meals in a disaster for that population. And then freeze-dried and dehydrated foods. And freeze-dried and dehydrated foods for healthcare are fairly new concepts. And one of the pros are very similar to what we're seeing with canned foods. It's familiar. We can meet the needs of those therapeutic diets and modified textures. Very easy to prepare. So many of these are just to add water, hot or cold. And there's a lot of different options available for the market, some even specific for healthcare. The biggest challenge with freeze-dried and dehydrated foods as part of a disaster supply there's definitely initial upfront costs, and you do want to evaluate water needs in a disaster. So are you going to need to keep additional water for your disaster plan? So one of the questions that I'm having here is related to staging disposable items, plates, cups, cutlery, water. That is such a great question because on top of staging disaster food, you most certainly want to have a stock available. And this can be done very similar to the way that I suggested we meet the needs of supplements by having par stocks or having a separate dedicated supply of staged disposables. And more often than not, we recommend that separate dedicated supply of staged disposables because it just makes things a little bit easier to utilize in a disaster. And also those disposable items don't have an expiration date for, you know, your plates, your cutlery, your spoons. As far as dishwashers not working, those of us in healthcare have seen that happen many, many, many times. Dishwashers go down, you can't use any of your warewashing or glassware, you have to go to disposables. And that can happen in some facilities, you know, once every handful of years. So yes, it's a great idea to keep those items. So kind of back to wrapping up food, what food is best for your healthcare facility? It may be a combination of these 5, and we've seen a number of healthcare facilities utilize that. And every single one has some pros and some challenges. And if you want to have a further discussion, definitely reach out to our team, and we're happy to support you by evaluating those. So the next thing that we want to look at in our time that is left is water. And water can be a massive challenge for a healthcare facility. And that was also on that question that we had as it related to cutlery, cups, spoons, scoops, spoodles. Having additional water is critical. Now, of course, when we're looking at water recommendations, 1 gallon of water per person per day for food and nutrition services is a minimum recommendation because, of course, you're going to want to have at least a half gallon of drinking water, but food prep also requires water. Whether you have a canned supply or you have a dehydrated supply, you're still going to need water to prepare that food. So you want to have at least 1 gallon of water per person per day. Some states like Florida and some counties like Pinellas County are going to recommend and require you have additional water. I also know of a number of healthcare organizations that want to see at least 2 gallons of water per person per day for drinking. And then, of course, facilities management has additional water needs. If you're going to do surgeries, dialysis, hygiene, toilet flushing, these are all additional considerations. But 1 gallon is critical. Okay. So moving on, and then there's another question that I will address as soon as we wrap up water. So I already mentioned 1 gallon of water per person per day. That is the common recommendation that we see. There are a lot of different ways that you can meet those needs. And oftentimes we don't want to throw all of our eggs in one basket. If you've got one of those multi-thousand gallon tanks that goes in your healthcare facility, those are wonderful. But again, per the CMS disaster rule, we have to be able to evacuate food, water, pharmaceutical, and medical supplies in a disaster. And so having a mixture of different water products can be very nice. So highlighted on this slide are 55-gallon drums, and those are about 420 gallons when they're full. They can be transported, but you want to make sure that you have the ability to lift and transport those and load them when needed. Other options are canned water, and canned water is anywhere from 30 to 50 year shelf life. One of the things that's nice about them beyond the shelf life is they are simple and easy to evacuate. Similar to some of the products we were looking at earlier, though, for food, the long shelf life canned water does have an initial investment, but a lot of the facilities that are utilizing it like it because they don't have to constantly rotate the water. Another alternative that is really nice are the water blocks highlighted here. And water blocks are nice because you use a similar footprint as you would with a large tank, but it's simple and easy to evacuate. And if you utilize a chlorine-based water preserver, you could get a 5-year shelf life out of the water in your water blocks. And we've known of campuses that then take these water blocks and utilize them at the 5 years for watering and doing other items around their healthcare facility. So one of the questions was MOUs with services that provide meals for wildland fires. And that is most certainly true. You could have memorandums of understanding like we saw in Houston with restaurants. That's something that we saw quite a bit. With restaurants, catering companies that could come out during a wildland fire. In order to have those MOUs in place, you just want to make sure that you've really evaluated the capabilities and capacities and is the infrastructure in place to allow that to happen. Oftentimes, depending on your state and your surveyors, They want to know that you have a plan for your specific healthcare facility that isn't solely the restaurant across the street is going to come and provide food. Something that we saw in the hurricanes that happened throughout the Gulf last year is some of the hospitals had a surge far beyond what was expected. And some of that was because patients were calling family members and saying, come on down to the hospital and wait this hurricane out. And that can definitely put a little bit of wrinkle in some of those arrangements. So you can most certainly have MOUs. Most certainly CMS supports MOUs, but they are recommending that you may want to have those MOUs start after the 72 hours because the infrastructure may not be in place in advance. But any relationships you could build, any communication you could build in advance is wonderful. Another great relationship to have, we still have a couple minutes, is if you have a church next door to your healthcare facility or an arena or a large stadium, anything that can hold a large amount of people, but also these types of buildings and organizations often have a commercial kitchen in case your commercial kitchen is damaged. So that is really our whole presentation today. I want to thank everybody for attending today and listening. There are definitely a lot of questions, so I'm going to go ahead and say thank you and then check some of the questions that are coming in our chat queue. So one of the questions in our chat queue are related to trailers. And there are definitely trailers that you can have memorandums of understanding with. So one of the organizations that I know of in particular is Trailers to Go or Kitchens to Go. And you can have a relationship or a contract with an organization like that. And in a disaster, they could bring a trailer if the infrastructure of your kitchen is damaged. And they're fully functioning kitchens that you could prepare full meals in. So some of the considerations you'll want to have with those is make sure that you have food and nutrition services, essential staff on hand to prepare and scale recipes. And that's definitely something that out of Hurricane Harvey, we heard from some of our partners is they had food, they had water, they had electricity. They didn't have the staff to scale recipes. So as you're working with your food and nutrition team, make sure to address that and also train incident command on kitchen practices, the recipes available, the diet orders, and how to prepare those if needed. And with that, I'm going to hand it back off and see if there are any additional questions to address today and say thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for sharing all of the information that you have for us. I think it's very important and it's timely for many people, and it's given, at least for myself, quite a bit for me to think about regarding meals and meal planning. Are there any other questions that anybody has for Joe before we end this webinar? Okay. I, again, want to say thank you to Joe. We will be doing a Collaborate with College, which is our once a month discussion group where we will start that discussion off with meals and meal planning and food planning for disaster. And then it will, of course, morph into whatever questions that you guys have for each other and one another. This is an open-ended discussion-based webinar, so it's highly recommended that for that webinar, which is in 2 weeks and listed on our website, it's highly recommended for you to have a working microphone because there won't be a presentation. It will be only discussion, and if you are participating, we'd love to have you involved in the discussion. So with that, once again, I say thank you to Joe, and hopefully we will talk to you all again soon. Have a great day.